We are recording. Gavin, take it away.
Cool. So yeah, thanks very much for having me. So a couple of weeks ago, I was assigned this ticket, generalized patch endpoint of protected branches API. And myself and Igor helped me a lot with it. It was one of the first PRs or first issues that I worked on. And he kind of, given that it was looking at Community Edition and Enterprise Edition, he seemed to think that it might be a good idea to kind of, present it to the team and see if people are aware of some of the context around working with Enterprise versus Community Edition code. So for a lot of you, this might be pretty much like day-to-day sort of stuff, but for me, I guess, and maybe some others on the team, maybe not. So basically, we had this endpoint for protected branches API for patch. And you can see here in the code, so this is in the documentation, this is before we made our change. We have this patch endpoint, but it was only available to premium tier customers. And the issue is about making the patch endpoint more generic. So, we can add different attributes, different parameters to the endpoint and do different things with it, update different attributes, etc. So after we made our change, we now have here on the right-hand side, you'll see this is for 15.6, and we have our patch endpoint. And instead of the whole endpoint being for premium customers only, we have our premium attribute here is marked as premium. So how does this work? How do the two different code bases interact? And how do we go about achieving something like this? So there's a really good blog post about this, which explains how GitLab has come to use the Community Edition and Enterprise Edition and what it was formerly. So as far as I can tell, formerly it was two different repositories, and MORs would get kind of pushed from one to the other, and maintaining that and keeping the specs functioning in that context was proving quite difficult as the project got more complex. So some of you guys in the engineering team you may have been here for when this was done, but they kind of decided, as far as I can tell, to move to just having the Enterprise Edition as the single repository and break out the Enterprise Edition code into a separate folder within the repo. So if we look here at RubyMine, you can see on the right-hand side here in the root of the project, we have an EE folder. So that's where all our Enterprise Edition code goes. And that effectively gets injected into the core of the product. So for this particular issue that I was working on, obviously this is before we've made any of our changes. I'm here on the tag 15.5. We can see we have our patch endpoint, and we can see, so for this API, and we look at the protected branches API endpoints here, we can see at the bottom we have API protected branches, excuse me, prepend with mod API protected branches. So what that does is it goes off into the EE folder and looks for an EE namespace here, and it'll, kind of through convention, inject that code into the bottom of our API class here. So that's how it was kind of working in place. All of the endpoint was only available to Enterprise Edition customers. So the way this works, the prepend with mod, is quite well documented in the guidelines for implementing EE features. And there's a lot of different ways we can override CE methods. So we can take CE code and we can manipulate it, override it, and call it, and extend it in this way. And there's a few things we need to look out for, like using or flagging that we have overridden methods here in case it's silently forgotten, or being careful with guard clauses, etc. So this is, if you're encountering this sort of stuff, obviously this document is well worth a read, and it's quite thorough. It'll guide you in the right direction. So if we move forward into what we did in order to solve the problem, just go back to master. So we ended up kind of moving that whole patch endpoint here into the protected branches API and making a few other changes along the way, but mostly it's very similar. We added in the patch endpoint, and then we added our params separately. So in this API service here, we have our attributes down the bottom. And in the Enterprise Edition, Enterprise Edition API service here on the left, you can see that we override the attributes. And if we have the Enterprise Edition permission, we add our code owner approval required into the attributes. So that effectively is the check to see, does the user have the ability to use Enterprise Edition features? And we can kind of isolate it down to a singular attribute. I've noticed here that I think I should have added the override flag on top of this method as well. So that's something I probably have to come back and clean up. So effectively then, what that allows us to do is add another param like allow force push into the core of the product, which is like non-Enterprise Edition code, and utilize, instead of duplicating out another patch endpoint, we can just use the same one. And in that way, we've kind of Community Edition attributes and Enterprise Edition attributes put together. So that's kind of it. It's quite short, sorry. I think that the technical challenge of why GitLab decided to kind of implement the system like this is really interesting. And there's these two blog posts kind of describe it in a lot of detail. They describe some of the issues the team were running into before they made the change. And then, effectively how Ruby solved the problem by allowing us to add our modules in separately. If you read through this, there's quite an interesting bit, which I can't find now that I'm presenting it live. So yeah, any questions? This is probably pretty simple for a lot of you, sorry.
I do have not necessarily a question, but I noticed the update, I've also been working on protected branches, but for the graph APIs, so I have quite a lot of insight into this. So in the EE version, access levels like push, merge, and unprotect also allow us to specify a user or a group. But I'm not seeing that in your code. Is that something that we should be including in this endpoint?
Yeah, I think there's a follow-up ticket for this, which I'm currently working on, which isn't merged yet, which we are allowing access levels to be specified. So effectively, this is like the kind of laying the groundwork for the ability to add those attributes later on. Yeah. So I actually have an MR up for that at the moment. I might ping you in. What do you think?
Yeah, I've got one, Gavin.
Go ahead.
So what happens with testing? How do you handle the testing for these?
Well, effectively, there's another bank of specs for Enterprise Edition. Let me see. And as far as I'm aware at the moment, you write specs for Enterprise Edition code, and then you write your specs for Community Edition code, and they should be, you should be reasonably able to isolate them like that. There is some detail about that in the documentation here as well. But
so in this case, we would have specs for those 3 columns or fields in the Community Edition, and then we'd have a spec that tested only the new field, or would test everything together?
No, you would have in the Enterprise Edition, I have another spec which tested for just the Enterprise Edition attribute.
Okay. I have a second question, but I'll see if someone else has a question first.
I had a question that already has been answered, so.
Well, my next question, maybe you might be able to help us with, Amy. So, when a customer has I don't know, or maybe not, but when a customer has a self-hosted environment, And if they're on the community edition, do we, when we look at the documentation, we see, oh, this is a premium feature. Do we somehow segregate the documentation, or do they have documentation that says you have these are premium features and you just don't have them?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
That's why we have the labels at the top of every page. And if there is a subheading in the page that differs from the H1 on the page, we label those subheadings.
Okay, but they
Yeah.
don't. The community doesn't get any different version of the documentation.
No,
Okay.
the /EE that you see is a leftover from combining the two.
Okay.
I'm just going to hand wave and say, you'll find spiders if you go looking for spiders. Don't go looking for spiders. This is a spider.
Yeah, when I joined, we had the two instances, and I remember thinking, what on earth are they doing here? And then we had the merge, and that was a great move, I thought.
Yeah, it's better, but we traded one set of problems for another, but that's frequently, I'm talking to engineers, y'all know this.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
Well, actually, one related to documentation. So, if you notice this web page on the right-hand side, we have this table of attributes. This is for the response, I believe. Is that correct, Gavin? This is describing what will be returned in the response.
No, these you can send.
Oh no, this is in the request. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So currently, there's some difference between all the different pages. So we have patch projects ID protected branches name. So in here we have two parameters, ID and name. In some of these pages, we have a table that describes just those parameters for the URL. And then in other pages like this one, we don't have that, but we have a mixture of both the URL parameters and the body parameters, but we're not really describing like where they're inserted. So it's not really a question for Gavin. I think this is more like pointing something out for Amy to be aware of. I think we need to do better on this, where we're actually like really describing how these things are used.
Yes, and Patrick is probably about to hide off camera from some of the MRs we've been working on lately. I am currently dependent on my engineers to get this, but yeah, I have been cleaning up some of the API related pages, and creates are in, okay, I don't know if they're actually in worse shape than the rest of the API docs, but they're definitely old. Hi, Igor, thank you. And I personally would like to see us spell out both sets, both the parameters and all of the responses. But that requires me bothering all of you. So
well, it's not bothering. And Amy, I just want to say, now that we're actually on the record, thank you so much for taking this initiative, because I don't think we'll find that. I think we'll find that you're going over and above on this, and it's really appreciated, because clean documentation is very important.
It is.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I knew going in, these docs are old. It's been a while since somebody's actually looked at all of them as a set and said, y'all consistent? And the answer is no, not even close.
Yeah.
So I would love to do more of these. I am actually holding off because I don't want to overload any of you.
Well, what we can do is we can create the issues and treat them as stretches for the research. I think that would work fine. Yeah. I
would be happy to help with that. Thank you.
Igor.
Just a quick note, maybe we need to wait a bit on this one, since you mentioned, Sean, that we have this work group for API. Maybe we will receive some insights from that work group. So maybe not to do redundant work, we can wait on this one and see what insights they have on the documentation as well, and on the API that we're using.
That's a great point.
I'm fine with that. Thank you.
So Gavin, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and very informative. Maybe you can drop the links in the document. You look like you do it every day. Thanks very much. I better stop the recording, I guess.